just so you know.
Sounds good.
Maria, good to see you. Are you there? There you are.
Yes. Hi.
Hey, Maria.
Hi.
You guys know each other?
Yes.
We've had PAA, no? A couple
PAA,
times.
and I think maybe an ASA, but I remember PAA, but I'm not sure if ASA also. I think
Maybe. Uh-huh.
Maria sent me a text message about how to pronounce your name today, but I'm still going to screw it up.
Yeah.
So how do you pronounce it? I have a theory of how I would pronounce it.
Me?
Yeah.
Masferrer?
No,
Masferrer.
your last name. No, Viñao.
Oh. Maria, yours.
Ah, my last name.
Yes.
Big now.
Big now?
Big now.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
No, I was saying earlier that I don't know how you pronounce it in English. I mean, I would pronounce it like that in Spanish, but.
Oh, I pronounce it the same in English and Spanish.
Good.
Okay, well, I think we're a couple minutes past time and it's kind of slow to grow here. So I think we have most people here. So welcome everyone again to this week's seminar. We're excited to have Dr. Claudia Masferrer as our speaker, and also Dr. Williams as the here from the Department of Sociology, who will formally introduce Dr. Masferrer. And so I'm going to turn it over, but I just wanted to mention a couple of things. Again, please use the Q&A as you think of your questions. Just go ahead and type those in. If it's a clarifying question, I'll try to intervene and help with that. If it's a bigger question, we'll just wait to the end and have more of a discussion. And I will unmute you so you can go ahead and ask your own question. We can have more of a back and forth. The other thing I wanted to mention was that there is a student meeting afterwards, so everyone can follow up with Dr. Masferrer and talk to her about her work and her career. So we have sent out emails about that, but if you don't have that link, we will also put it in the chat so that you can see that at the end and then go ahead and go to that meeting right after the talk. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Williams. Thank you again.
Thank you. Dr. Masferrer, it's a pleasure to have you here. Unfortunately, we can't really have you here. I will look forward to meeting you in person someday very much, as I'm sure other people will. But I can also say that it looks like Dr. Masferrer travels a lot, and thus we might all have an opportunity to meet her. Especially, it looks like she travels in the demographic circles, as we all do. So Dr. Masferrer works on migration in the North American triangle of the US, Canada, and Mexico. And she is truly, truly an expert on this topic as she studies it and works it and apparently lives it as well. Dr. Masferrer has lived and worked and studied in Mexico City, in Austin, Texas, and Montreal, Canada. So she has lived the North American triangle. She received her PhD in sociology at McGill University in Montreal in 2014. And since then, she's now an associate professor at the Center for Demography, Urban and Environmental Studies at El Colegio de Mexico. She's also an adjunct professor of sociology at McGill University, indicating that they did not want to give her up in any way whatsoever. So she has published over 30 academic publications in such places as Demography, Population Research and Policy Review, and other journals high ranking in the US and Canada and Mexico. Again, you see this, this trend of the North American Triangle migration. She also writes policy reports in Mexico and Canada and the Migration Policy Institute that is very well known in the US. Dr. Masferrer, as I said, studies Mexican, mostly migration to the US and Canada. She's also picked up on return migration to Mexico and the incorporation of return migrants, and especially minors who are returning from America to Mexico. So as you can see, she's on the cusp of the breaking issues of migration studies in this North American triangle. And so with that, I will not take up any more of her time, and I am very much looking forward to what you have to tell us today, and hopefully we'll get to meet in the future, Dr. Masferrer. Passing it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Natalie, for the very kind words and introduction. And I really thank Sarah Curran for inviting me to this seminar. It was really excited when she contacted me, and Maria, and both Marias for organizing this meeting and the other meeting. I guess it is timely to talk about return from the United States to Mexico today when we are about to know what will happen with the elections, although the results will come out officially in I don't know when. But I want to say that I really liked how Natalie mentioned the North American triangle because usually we think of the Northern Triangle of Central America. And I agree with her that I have to say that when I left Austin and I went to Canada, Bob Hammer told me, go ahead on to Canada. You might become the NAFTA specialist and expert. And I think since then it was in my interest trying to understand North America. And I really have pushed to consider migration North America, the 3 countries. And I think return is definitely a central piece in trying to maintain the links between these countries. When I was asked what would I like to present, I decided to talk about this recent paper that was written in co-authorship with my colleague Nicole Denier from the University of Alberta. But I want to start really quickly with some images that I think that can motivate a little bit the discussion that we're going to have today. So let me just see. And I have to say that I have been showing these pictures at different moments in time in different talks since 2017, when they just appeared after I came back to Mexico. And it's really unfortunate how little has changed since these years, okay? So on the left, you can see the picture of Eduardo Garcia, who was a migrant worker. He arrived to California when he was really young. He was a convict, he was a deportee several times, but now was a star chef featured in the New York Times. His son lives in the United States. The restaurant is called Maximo, as his son, following his son's name. And he has a very successful story. And I also like to think of all the unsuccessful stories. And on the right, there's also an example that was actually published on the same week of someone who committed suicide after being deported several times to Tijuana. He also has kids in the United States, and they were both detained for having small amounts of marijuana with them, which now actually today after the elections, you can also think that, it would have, in some places have depenalized this possession, but they have very different futures, right? And at the same time when this was published, just before President Trump got into office in November 2016, there was also a lot of discussions about the US-born minors that were going to schools in Tijuana mainly, following these reports, and then were kind of invisible. They were raised in the United States. They were having lots of challenges in schools. And so I think when I came back to Mexico in 2016, and a lot of the discussion started to center on these minors. And it's very clear that a lot of the discussion today is still on what's happening in the border, although as you will see later, there are US-born minors everywhere. And this picture, it's the old president, Peña Nieto from Mexico, but also you have to think that in 2016, when I came back, there was a huge discussion on the political use, I would say, of returnees, because they were back in Mexico and suddenly they would be able to vote in 2018 election in Mexico. So there was a clear interest of return migration, and just like for political reasons, just as we have this in the United States, right? And this is an old picture of President Trump, but then I think the discussions today are still about what will happen for all these people. And then on the right view, I just want to highlight that we have a very complex phenomenon in Mexico in terms of migration, where we have migrants from all over the world. And they actually coexist with returnees in many border cities, but throughout the country. And I think this puts definitely a very complicated position to Mexico. So I just want to start with these pictures because I think that they kind of set up how little has changed in terms of the discussion and in terms of what we know, unfortunately. But I also think that the current situation puts also different challenges, and I'll talk about that at the end. So as I said, I'm going to focus today on this paper that was written in co-authorship with Nicole Denier. She was actually a graduate student with me at McGill University. She focuses her work on other things. She's mainly interested in work. And I think later on we can talk with the grad students. I think this is kind of one of the examples where you, from grad school, just collaborate with your classmates and that become your colleagues, and then later, they're also your friends. But we, I think, did very interesting work. And I was interested in return. She was interested in work, and we focused on returning to a new Mexican labor market and just like the regional variation of this economic incorporation of returnees. So that's what I'm going to focus today. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the fact that over the past decade and a half, 2000, 2015, now we are in 2020, but we do not have data still from the 2020 census. There was an unprecedented number of Mexican migrants that reversed course and returned to Mexico, right? So usually you think about all the work that has been published on the zero net migration rate, right? Saying that the number of migrants that came back to Mexico and that the immigrants from the United States was larger than the number that immigrants from Mexico that arrived to the United States. And that's why we have a change in net migration rate. But actually, what was really clear was that between 2005 and 2010, the number of returnees tripled. And so from the Mexican census, we found that it was about little less than 1 million returnees. And I've always been asked, okay, was it an increase of deportation? Was it an effect of the Great Recession or changing economic conditions? And we do not have an answer. It was actually both, but we do know that there was a large increase in deportations. And what this meant as well was that a lot of return was actually driven by family reunification. And I like to say that all of our numbers from the Mexican census are underestimated. If you think that for one person that is deported, there might be others that are joining, right? And this is what we actually see. We see that around 1.5 million, according to DHS data, were removed during the Bush administration, and close to 2 million during the presidency of Barack Obama. This continued under Trump administration and actually continued post-COVID. In the last year, we did have an increased number of deportations. And in addition to involuntary return, the Great Recession definitely eroded economic opportunities in the United States. And we have a lot of ethnographic work that actually talk about how these reasons coexist all the time, right? So maybe the decision to come back to Mexico was motivated by as a family was motivated because someone might fear deportation or because someone actually had a removal order, right? So, and I have to say that this massive spike in return that was observed in 2010 was accompanied by kind of like a novel characteristic of sites of resettlement, moving away from traditional standing areas and returning to locations that were relatively more attractive in terms of the economic opportunities that they would provide. So you see northern border areas, tourist centers, and large metropolitan areas. Now, you could think that maybe there are other ideas of why someone would choose to stay close to the border, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But I think that one of the biggest changes was actually this idea that in the paper we talk about shadow migration. I also like to think about it as linked migrations. And I think that family migration remains a critical pool for return, and in a very different way as we were thinking of it before. So if you're familiar with the literature of Mexico-US migration, you have the idea of migration being predominantly male, and then return being to these places where mostly spouses or children had been left behind. And we actually see that this is not definitely the case only, right? It's still the case for many, but you actually see that there's an increase of US-born accompanying parents, siblings, and spouses. And I've published about the US-born minors, but today I'm going to talk a little bit more about as well the spouses and the parents and the siblings. And a lot has been written in terms of the challenges that these US-born minors face in integrating to school and to the educational system, just like kind of like changing their traditions and their way of dressing. And there's a vast literature focusing on the minors, but we really do not know what happens when these minors enter the labor market. And we do not know what happens with the US-born immigrants that are joining the returnees that are not necessarily their children. So we do see an increase of US-born women, for example, right, who are spouses. So and the spouses would enter the labor market after having US experience and with very little work experience in Mexico. So I think just trying to think that minors that age and enter the labor market will be different than spouses that are actually joining others, right? And so what we see and what we claim a little bit in the paper is that there is a big change in terms of selection. And there is an evolution of the patterns and the changes of resettlement that need to be taken into account. And historically, the studies of labor market integration of returnees have focused on the role of migration as a means to capital accumulation, as a correlative development in communities of origin. And if you're familiar with the literature, you know that there is this idea that target earners migrate to the United States, they send back remittances, and then when they return, they also bring back the resources, the skills to start small businesses, usually, right? So there's a large literature that focuses on business formation and being an entrepreneur. And it's true that returnees are more likely than native-born to be self-employed. But what we find and what we actually look is that this is kind of like beyond what we actually see today, right? This pattern would be consistent for those that are engaged in routine circular migration to and from Mexico. But if you think about the fact that many have lived in the United States for long periods of time and like all the different kinds of family formation that they have gone through, we actually see that this is changing. And we do see from different studies that actually recent returnees are engaging differently in the labor market as before, right? And as this kind of like old model of circular migration or predominantly male migration. And so actually using census data from 1990, 2000, and 2010, Parrado and Gutierrez in different work have actually shown that Mexican returnees are less likely to be employers than inactive. And this was associated usually with family formation, but they also show that wage earners and self-employed workers had lower earnings in 2010 in comparison with previous decades, right? Which was true both in new and traditional sending areas, right? So they actually distinguish between these traditional sending areas and the rest of the country. And specifically for men, later they also show that this is partially attributable to changing mix of occupations of employment, right? So there is a shift of the type of work that they're doing upon return. And taken all together, you would think that this literature suggests that the recession and the involuntary nature of return that is partially associated with enforcement of immigration might have interrupted the traditional processes of capital accumulation in the United States and the possibilities of investment upon return to Mexico, right? So kind of like forcing returnees into a wage labor market in a new destination, if you think that some people actually come back to different places, which is something that we are actually seeing. But when we talk about returning to Mexico, one of the things that I would really want you to think about is that kind of like return to where, right? Mexico is not homogeneous. Mexico is actually very diverse. It has a very diverse economy in terms of economic development, industry, and types of production, and just like the possibilities for engaging returnees into the labor market and incorporating them. And I don't know if you know these states, but we also have a lot of diversity in terms of poverty rates, for example, right? So if you compare Nuevo León, which is where Monterrey is, bordering Texas, 14% of the population live in poverty. If you compare Chiapas or Oaxaca, this is more than 70%, right? So just the local conditions of where returnees are living upon return and the possibilities for developing are very, very different. And in terms of how regional development in Mexico has been changing recently, it's interesting that there was a shift from manufacturing that was kind of like in the 70s and 80s actually thought as, there was a whole industrialization process in the US, Mexico, along the Mexico-US border. But as time passed, they moved further south to the Bajío, that is located in Guanajuato and other states that are considering the traditional sending area in Mexico. But you actually see manufacturing also in Puebla, for example, right? Having, I don't know, Volkswagen and automobile companies moving further south. So what we can see is that actually these sectoral shifts with a huge decline in unionization is coupled with an increase of informal employment in Mexico. And we also see that there was a huge educational expansion, but at the same time, there was a decline in returns to education in the Mexican labor market. So, and this is not only for returnees, but university graduates earn 30% more today than they did in 2008, okay? So there is a huge decline in returns for education. And so returnees upon arrival face, usually they are not as, they did not catch up with this increase in education, but at the same time, there is a mismatch with the skills. And this is actually what we will see. I'm just showing you the 4 regions that we are gonna be working on. The northern region in blue, the traditional sending areas in purple, the center, which is, Mexico City is located in just like really small state in the middle in yellow, and then the south, southeast. If you're familiar with Durant's and Massey's work and definition of traditional regions, this is not the regions. We actually define them a little bit different because we believe that this needs to be closer to the economic development, and so they put some states in places that we do not consider are very similar. So, but it's very likely it's very similar. When you think about what does this literature say in terms of the differences in the regions, but in integration for returnees, we see that there's a large amount of research, and I'm just citing here a very few that talk about how there is very limited translation of the migration experience and all the skills that were acquired in rural areas. A lot of studies on return has focused on what happens to rural areas, and I'll show you later that there's actually being an increase of return to large urban areas. But what we see is that, rural areas have different conditions, and imagine you were in California working in building pools or landscaping, and then you arrive to a rural area. All of the skills that you might have learned are very difficult to translate, right? There's also an idea that, and this is something I've also written about in terms of going back home as a question, because there's also an increasing number of people that come back to areas that are not their communities of origin, and we see different examples of rural indigenous migrants that actually go back to Oaxaca City instead of going to the small rural communities, or people from Maya communities in Yucatan going to Merida or Cancun, where tourist opportunities in the tourist sector are there. And it's close, right? But you can it's, I don't know, 4 hours away from your community, but it's not your community. You also see this in traditional sending areas like Nayarit, going back to Rivera Nayarit, which is like a booming tourist destination, which I guess that after COVID might not be that booming, but it was definitely a growing tourist destination in the Pacific Ocean. But then you also see, for example, the case of migrants arriving to metropolitan area of Mexico City, or from different places all over the country, right? Nezahualcóyotl, which is a municipality that has attracted a large amount of internal migrants. So what it means to come back to a place where you are not necessarily originally from will definitely also bring different challenges. And if you think about these examples, they are driven by the economic development of these cities, of these places, and just like the types of work that people can engage in. And what is interesting is that there is a large amount of ethnographic work that has documented the importance of the local context of reception in Mexico. And most of this research has been written in Spanish. There are qualitative studies that are very rich in terms of the experiences that the returnees face. But when you think about the quantitative studies, most of them limit to traditional and non-traditional sites. Sometimes they do consider if it's a border state or not. But I think what we really wanted to highlight is just like what happens within these different contexts. And so our general question, research question is, given the shifting nature of return and the evolution of Mexican labor, how did migrants fare upon return, basically, but across different regions? And we know that our regions are very limited. There's also a lot of heterogeneity within regions, but we try to define these regions in a way that they have a meaning in terms of economic regional development. We want to see how the economic incorporation of those that returned over time in these 20 years vary across regions in Mexico. The paper will discuss more of the other changes that happen over these 20 years in Mexico, but also trying to understand the meaning of US experience. So we actually compare returnees, but also US-born migrants. And we know that they're different, but we want to know if they fare similarly in the Mexican labor market. And this is something new because usually these US-born migrants are not studied in this context. And then, if these processes vary or not for Mexican, for men and women. So I'm gonna go quickly in terms of the data and measures, but we use Mexican census data 2000, 2010, the 2015 intercensus survey, which is a mid-decennial survey. For migration experience, we distinguish between those using the question of place of residence 5 years prior. We distinguish between those who were in Mexico, so Mexican non-movers and internal migrants as well, and then those who were in the United States, Mexicans who were returnees from the United States, but also US-born migrants. We're gonna study the natural log of the income from employment. We deflated 2010 Mexican pesos, and I'm gonna be showing today the adjusted monthly salary income. Very standard and straightforward. OLS models, we stratify them by sex. We limit ages 15 to 59, considering that maybe returning at later age will, there's a higher incentive for being inactive. And we control for a series of sociodemographic, labor, and contextual characteristics that we know that impact wages, but also we include the interaction of time and region of residence just to understand if there have been differences over time for these different contexts. And let me just show you 3 maps showing the total number of returnees by state for you to have an idea of where they are. And this is 2000, 2010, 2015, 2010 being the largest. So in total, we had about 850,000 returnees compared to 250 in 2000 and 440,000 in 2015. Definitely concentrated in Jalisco and other states in the traditional sending area. But I have to say that there are returnees in all over Mexico, and I have been doing some analysis at the municipality level, and all of the municipalities have returnees in 2015. And almost all of the municipalities have US-born minors, actually. So they're quite spread, and this brings different challenges, but it's not necessarily an issue of the traditional area. When you think about who these returnees are, I want to highlight the differences between men and women in terms of the economic active population. So Mexico has very small female labor force participation compared to other countries. Returnees are concentrated in the age groups of 30 to 44. About 30% of the returnees are women. And this has actually been very consistent over time. if you think about where they are settling, just in terms of rural, urban, and size of the localities of the residents where they are, I just want to highlight two things. So there was actually an increase of returnees, relative increase of returnees in small rural areas of less than 2,500, a population less than 200,000, very small rural areas, right? But if you think about the percentage of returnees in metropolitan areas of 100,000 and more, in 2000 and 2015 is actually very similar. And in 2010, we had more return. We also had more return to kind of like smaller urban areas. But I would say that there is an obsession of studying return to rural areas, and this is not necessarily new, that there has a lot of return to urban areas. I think, we can talk later about why this is the case, but just to highlight the importance of this kind of like bipolar distribution of returnees in small places, but also many returnees in larger places. When you think about where they're settling in terms of the regions, but only for men, we see, I'm just showing here for the sake of clarity, returnees and US born, we see a decrease of returnees in traditional areas, as I said, an increase in northern states. And this is true for both. And the increase of those in South and Southeast is also interesting and worth noting. If we had 2010, we actually see this a little bit more dramatic, but we also think that kind of like thinking of the changes over time, this makes a better picture. I'm not gonna, I don't want you to see all of these numbers because I'm sure you cannot see, but I just want to highlight two things of the different characteristics that we show. There are differences in terms of the age, the mean age at return. So in those who are in the north tend to be actually younger than others. But then when you actually see, what happens in terms of years of schooling, there's not necessarily a different clear pattern. But what I want to highlight, and I'm going to focus on the self-employed, informal wage salary worker and formal wage salary worker, and I'm just going to show you this. So there's actually the minority is actually self-employed, and this is only for men. But yes, returnees from the United States are more likely to be self-employed than internal migrants or non-migrants. But as I said, like a large majority are actually wage salary workers. And when you think about women, you see a very similar pattern in terms of settlement, although you actually see a larger concentration of, in the northern states, and we can talk later about why that can be the case. But when you think about self-employment, you actually see a similar picture in terms of mostly being wage salary workers and not self-employed, right? And actually, for women, this is actually a little bit higher than men, and for different reasons. But I have to say that this picture is quite complicated by the fact that there is a large amount of inactive, in quotes, women that are not in the labor force, and that when you think about these percentages, we need to take into account that about 60% of returnees and non-migrants are actually out of the labor force from women. And for men, this has been changed a little bit, but you actually see that about 20% of the men in these ages are actually out of the labor force. What is interesting for men, and I just want to see when we compare informal wage workers and formal wage workers, we actually see, again, among returnees, higher rates of informality. And we're measuring informality as those who are not, who do not have a contract and who do not have benefits, receive benefits from employment. But if you see, even among non-migrants, these are actually very high percentages, among almost 1/3. And for women, we actually see that, non-migrants have larger rates of formality, but it's again very biased by the fact that we have a lot of women out of the labor force. Not gonna look at the numbers, but yes, men earn more than women. The gap has closed in terms of the income between returnees and the rest for all the regions. But what is interesting, I think, is the results when we actually adjust for all of the demographic and labor characteristics. So these are the mean adjusted incomes from employment by region for men for our 4 groups. And I just want to highlight a couple of things. So in blue, you have the recent US-born migrants. And as you see, the gap has closed for everyone, including the US-born migrants, except in the north. So the deterioration of the economic fortunes happened regardless of you were born. And the idea that returnees, shown in red, had better economic outcomes than the non-migrants and even the internal migrants disappeared, right? And this is consistent to what Gutierrez and Parado were finding for 2010. So we actually see it in 2015 as well. But what is interesting is that it has a different effect across regions, but it happens everywhere. And in traditional sending areas, actually the returnees, when you think about how they were faring compared to those who were not movers, you actually see that this gap remains. So there's a little relative advantage, but it's not like they were returnees were doing great, right? But there is a large amount of literature that says that upon return to Jalisco or to traditional sending areas, returnees were actually faring better. And when you compare about what was happening in terms of salary income, this was not necessarily the case. For women, we actually see that, again, this happens everywhere except in the north, where US-born migrants still have this relative advantage. There was a deterioration, and actually when I present this to Mexican audiences, I always say that a US experience in Mexico is not necessarily valued, and they're just earning as bad as the rest of the population. And I just want to say this is deflated to 2010 pesos, but when we're talking about the mean in salary income, the US dollar is 20 to 1 peso. $1 is 20 pesos. And you just need to think that these are actually very low salaries and very low income. But this is how bad the Mexican economy is. So, there is a deterioration of the economic fortunes of the most recent cohorts of returnees. Actually, the wages declined the most outside of the traditional region, but actually, it's because they were earning less in the traditional sending region to begin with. The recent US-born experienced the sharpest decline, especially in the southern and central region. And again, the recent arrivals are doing worse than the previous cohorts. When we look at, I'm not showing this here, but when we look at the effects of the different controls and how they change and so on in the modeling strategy, we do see that part of this is explained by the changing educational attainment, the type of work and industry that they are actually being employed in. We also argue that there is a large selectivity into return that is also explaining these declining fortunes. What we discuss in the paper is that we need to understand a little bit better return, migration, and incorporation of returnees beyond self-employment. So we have evidence to say that it is not successful as it usually thought, right? You can say that maybe it's because of the changes in the composition or the reason for it to return, how prepared you are for returning, the savings, the resources, and the skills. But what we are actually seeing is that our findings are not necessarily aligned with successful business formation that other authors have found, or the successful transferability of skills. And part of this is because the skills are not gained by everyone, and they're not equally valued by everyone. So I put here just a very small note on the case of call centers. If you look at the literature that focus on return to Mexico City, there is also an obsession, a large amount of work focusing on call centers. But when you think about who acquire English proficiency and who can work in a call center. This is a very small portion of the population. So in general, I think, and the literature of return migration talks about it in other contexts as well, we need to think about kind of like beyond self-employment. And for the US-born migrants, we argue that we need to think beyond the children. So what happens so we know now that there are challenges to entering school, but we know that they're attending school, right? I mean, the quality might not be the best, but what happens when they enter the labor market? You might think that many of them will actually go back to the United States and work there, and that will pose a lot of different series of challenges. But we see that the advantage in Mexico is eroding, and we don't know exactly. I mean, these are recent migrants. We might know in 2020 very soon what happens with the census, but I think that we will see a deterioration that will continue. We also talk a little bit about the meaning of discrimination and anti-immigrant sentiment in Mexico and what it means to be a migrant. Here, a returnee, the differences, the challenges of being associated with deportees, the criminalization that occurs with this notion of returning because of a deportation. So I think that in general, we just need to think about that. And I just wanna, very quickly mention, because I know that I have like run out of my time. So there's another paper that focuses on the minors, and I want to say, I'm not going to show here the results, but if you're interested in thinking what happens with these minors, I invite you to think about that. And in this paper, we focus more in terms of the implications for the family, right? So I want to say that the first paper with Nicole focuses on what happens in the labor market for US-born and returnees. But if you think that you're a child in these families, in these mixed status families, of course, how your parents fare in the economic Mexican labor market, in the economy, will affect your future, right? So we also need to think that these two papers are somehow linked, because the fortunes of the returnees will impact the children, and many of these children are actually US born or Mexican born, but with US school experience. And we don't know what will happen when these children age. This is from the demography paper, but there was an increase of settlement, not showing this. There is an increase of minors in school ages, but we really wonder what will happen when they enter the labor market, and the previous results do not show very optimistic results. When you think about where they are, there is an increase. I mean, there is many in northern areas, but there are also in other regions of the country that have worse economic conditions than some places in the north. And then just to say that, yes, they're mostly living with Mexican parents, and this puts a lot of questions about the meaning of a mixed status binational family in Mexico. But I just want to close it by saying that we really want to know what happens in the future for this complex US-Mexico migrants, and then especially what happens in the context of the pandemic. So I've also written a little bit in terms of what will happen next, and we don't know what will happen next, but it's definitely something that we will need to think about. And so, yeah, thank you very much. And I'm really open for many questions. Let me just stop sharing my screen. I don't know how many questions there are. If not, I can, while people write their questions, I can also just like
yeah, please. Everybody put their questions in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Dr. Masferrer. That was wonderful.
So while people write their questions or jump in with the microphone, I just want to say that if you're interested in Mexico-US migration, but also just in different topics, I coordinate the seminar in Colmex. We have a lot of resources and publications and interviews and videos in both in English and Spanish. So I can share my screen again and then just show you the website if you're interested, while people write their questions.
Great. I have a question to start us off, but I'm not sure if Maria would have one. Maria, now. And can we put your seminar on our, I mean, can we note it on our newsletter and the like? Would that be?
Yeah, sure.
Mhm.
Sure.
So it was a lot to absorb.
I know.
But I very much enjoyed it. Thank you. And I was thinking about Felice Garib's book,
Mhm.
and in that was sort of in the back of my mind as I was listening and thinking about how the composition of migration to the US kind of changed over time, and how that compositional change might have influenced sort of the nature of our expectations, might have affected who comes back and the composition of the returnees.
Yeah.
It's a dynamic. I'm sure that's something you were thinking about, and it's just a comment. I'm just not sure how you might respond.
Yeah. I have a couple of reactions to that. So I love her work in terms of how she explains kind of like changes in the composition and in family and networks. My critique, not to her work, but in general, is that using MMP data has been great for advancing the field, but also biasing many of the results. So I think, and this is just, I mean, it's the nature of how it is. And I think the MMP effort is amazing for gathering data, but I do think that we need to think about what happens in other places that are not necessarily captured in MMP. And I know that MMP has expanded and has included more urban areas, but I think immigration from urban areas to the United States has increased over time, and the characteristics of these migrants are different than those from very small communities. And at the same time, you see that there have been different settlement patterns especially for those who are not from traditional sending areas that were captured by MMP at the beginning. So for example, migrants from Puebla, Tlaxcala, that are not necessarily considered, or Oaxaca or Chiapas, that have very different dynamics, had very different settlement patterns. And so they had very different kind of like ways of going back, but also just like, I mean, the types of networks and that they acquired. So I think that what we are finding, and I'm doing full work with returnees in Mexico City, and what we're finding is that many of the things that we know for tradition, from rural areas and MMP data holds, but for the logic and the rationale for coming back and for emigrating from urban areas is very different, right? So I think that, I think, if I'm correct, we cite Felice's work in terms of how the composition changed, the settlement patterns changed over time. When you think about the different processes and selectivity processes, you have the selectivity of emigrating to the United States, forming a family, settling, living 15, 20 years, coming back is a different process for selectivity, engaging in the labor market, staying in Mexico instead of going back to the United States, even if you're gonna be deported again or sent back to jail, whatever. It just talks about very different selectivity processes. And I think we are definitely analyzing a very select group of those, especially for women, of those who are in the labor market, right? And who, when you think about the families, if you are a US-born migrant living in Mexico, then, and you think of all those children of deportees, especially that are still in the United States, and the whole literature of family separation, you're also thinking of a very, very select group, right? So it's a select group of those that decide to come back together as a family to Mexico and settle. And we have 500,000 of them, but it is definitely a select group, right?
Thank you.
There's another.
Yeah, I don't know. Can you see the chat? We have one in chat. It's not in Q&A, and I've unmuted.
So it's from Araceli, I think.
Yeah. Would you like to ask your question?
Oh, yeah. Hola, Claudia. Bienvenida. Muchísimas gracias por esta presentación. Te lo agradezco tanto. Es tan difícil encontrar ese tipo de información. Y algo que es más difícil es encontrar el espacio para construir conocimiento en la lengua madre. En general en academia, pero especialmente, ¿no?, en este nivel de doctorado. So thank you everyone for giving me this moment. I was just talking to Claudia that it would be important to me, if there's time, to have a few minutes to try to construct this kind of knowledge and information in my mother language, which is Spanish. Would that be okay? And then I can translate as much as possible. Okay, bien. Bueno, me encanta tu presentación. Y algo que yo que tenía una pregunta es que yo estoy mirando la salud de la población de origen mexicano en Estados Unidos, y una limitación que yo encuentro en la literatura es que en la literatura de salud mental no hay una diferenciación entre grupos indígenas y grupos no indígenas de México. ¿Crees tú que esa sería una variable importante de investigar? Porque si hay una distribución diferente de dinero y de recursos, ¿puede ser eso algo que nos diga un poco sobre los factores de protección o de riesgo para estas comunidades?
Sí, gracias. I'm going to answer in English. And I guess the question will be clear for everyone else. Gracias, Araceli, por hacer la mención de la lengua materna. Y es algo, I mean, Sarah and I actually talked a little bit about doing research in your writing research in your mother tongue. So I actually think that it's important to have discussions about language in academia. And I do think that I write different when I write in Spanish and I write in English. And it has been weird coming back and returning and changing languages sometimes. In terms of Araceli's questions of mental health and among indigenous and kind of like the role of data, my recommendation for everyone, and regardless of the topic and regardless of if it's mental health or being indigenous in Mexico, would be just to go back to the research that was produced in Mexico in Spanish. There is a lot that has been written in Spanish on return about on return of indigenous communities, but also just return in general, in terms of health, in terms of the outcomes. And this is lost sometimes in academia because it's published as master's thesis, PhD thesis, undergraduate thesis that we do have in Mexico in Spanish. And yes, it's not peer reviewed and it's not published in demography, but it's like super interesting and super important work that is produced here. And it is quite challenging, I think, to find and just to reflect on how data will definitely impact the studies that we can do, right? And I think we're all aware of it. But I think just access to studies is also like a barrier that sometimes we have, and language is the first barrier that we sometimes have. But I think that when you took, after coming back, I started a literature review on studies like from different sources in Spanish and English. And I hope to tell you later soon about this book that should be forthcoming soon. And when you look about the vast amount of literature that has been published, that is not accessible to US scholars on different topics, right? So I found some things on mental health and access to health services and education, and but it's not cited, and it's always hard, right, to kind of like bring together these ideas. But my recommendation would be just think what it means to be from an indigenous community, from differences in mental health. There's a lot of quantitative data, mainly because these people are not accessing health services for mental health, right? And so there's also a difference there. I started analyzing a little bit the data on COVID and migration and in rural areas. And of course, there is a lot of underestimation of cases in places in rural areas in Mexico that do not have access to health services where tests are taken, right? So just like these different kinds of biases, I think we should all be aware of regardless of what we're studying. And if you're studying some topic that is not in the United States, then just, I don't know, if you're studying migrants in Germany, just go and read it in German, everything that has been published on immigrants, right? I think that's just like a general recommendation for everyone. I don't know if that answered your question, but it's just a reflection on both of these issues. There is some other question from Sarah.
No, I just was typed in.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, so
But
Neil, if you want to go ahead, Neil, I've unmuted you.
Oh, yeah. Claudia, thank you so much for this talk and that response in particular. In regards to your comments about MMP and Felice Scarap's work, are just using alternative data sources to track return migration. You had showed a map earlier in your presentation that looked like there was a spike in return migration numbers in 2010. And I'm wondering if you think this is a true spike in return migration or might be an artifact of comparing different data sources together. I'm guessing 2010 is from census and the other two are intercensal estimates. And then if you have any take on what is reliable when you're comparing different data sources. So I'm thinking like using things like Enavid as a source of return migration studies as well, even though it has like a smaller, quite smaller sample size.
Yeah, no, so the intercensal survey actually has a huge sample size. I think it's 23 million, so it's not a small survey at all.
Okay.
2010 census, I mean, it's actually larger than many censuses in other places. No, the 2010, it's actually 20% of the population. So that's intercensal survey. So it's actually quite big. I do believe in the spike of the observed in 2010. Actually, I think that it was much, much higher. When you think about the 1.5 million that were deported from, I mean, if you think about deportations, just deportations and calculate a rate of staying, removals, right? Not border apprehensions. I definitely think that there were like 2 million returnees in Mexico in 2010. Because we know that it's underestimated. I do not use Enavid. Well, I do use Enavid, and I actually have I'm writing a paper on Enavid, but the sample size is much smaller. So if you want to look at things at smaller geographical areas, it's not enough. What is kind of weird is that the sampling, it's kind of technical, but the sampling frame of Enavid 2018, 2014 are not necessarily the intercensal of 2015 because there was not, so it's the sampling frame of 2010. And so I think that there were large changes in Mexico in that period. And when you look at the 2014 Enavid data and the 2015 intercensal data, there are some states that are quite off, and the characteristics are a little bit off. And I believe more the 23 million sample size from the intercensal than the Enavid sample that I don't remember right now the size, but it's much, much smaller. So I think the advantage of Enavid is that it has a question of migration residence 1 year ago, which is something that we do not have in the census. And this is useful for understanding the flows. So that's definitely good. In 2020, we're going to have cost of return and cost of migration for everyone. So we will be able to see if there was changes in the cost of migration. I also do not use the intracensal questions on return that are asking you if you left and came back over the 5-year period, because then these actually do not capture those long-term residents in the United States that actually came back to Mexico and were not living in Mexico in that period, right? So this was the case for 2010 census data that captured, 2000 and 2010 that actually captured kind of immigration and return over the period. But if you think about the estimates of duration of residence that Pew has estimated, which were 50% have been in the United States more than 15 years, then asking someone to, if they left and they came back over the 5-year period doesn't make a lot of sense, right? So that's why I use residence 5 years ago, because then it captures immigrants and captures long-term residents in the United States that are now in Mexico. Yep. basically. And I mean, I don't use MMP myself, but I recognize all their work. I mean, it's just like reminding everyone always about the biases. That's it.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you again.
Thank you, Neil.
I think so. Any other questions? I think that's the last one I see. And I think is the link for the next meeting in the chat, Christine?
Yeah.
Okay, super. Okay, well, thank you again, and thanks.
Thank you.
Well,
Thank you for
Claudia, thank you. I want to talk more about the language issue. I want to talk about that. It's so important.
Let's talk about it. And thank you for the invitation. And I know that, as Sarah said, it's so much. And then I know that I speak really quickly sometimes, but there's a lot to put in. And thanks a lot.
It was great. It was great. Thank you so much.
Everybody go to the next meeting.
So, Claudia, you know to click on the
Yeah. I'll go there.
Thank you.
Thank you,
I'm not going to the next meeting, but I would love to talk to you sometime about migration.
Great. Let's do that.
Let's do a migration working group that's let's just do a bigger group.
Well, really, can I have you for one more minute? So I work on migration in Nepal, and I read on migration in South Asia and India and Pakistan, Bangladesh. And so much of what you said, it's very similar to what's going on in South Asia, but there's little differences. Like, oh yeah, I could pick that a little. It'll be South Asia. Well, it's different in South Asia. It's like this in South Asia. But it seems like in migration research, we don't read across regions. Like if you work on Mexico, Central America, North America, you don't read the European, you don't read South Asia, and likewise with other people. And I think we could gain a lot by talking to each other.
Let's do that. I want to do that. I want to have
And I mean, so I actually had a grad student from McGill. So she was like, I want to work with you over the summer, and she started, working on a lit review and return to other places. And it's amazing how much has been written in the last couple of years on these issues all over the world. And I mean, I was busy with other stuff, and I kind of lost track of that research. And then suddenly I'm like, yeah, the discussion of going beyond self-employment is the same is going on in Turkey, and other places. And
I feel like we could write a grant. I think we could write a grant to the Ford Foundation.
Sign yourself up.
Yeah, to the Ford Foundation or someplace someplace that cares about knowledge and advancing policy and something around that.
And I gotta say, it just went online, I think today or yesterday, a paper I just wrote on Nepali migration, and we basically used social network stuff that was all developed in Mexico.
But it's hard.
And it works differently there.
I can't deny the students.
Okay.
Yeah, so Claudia, you know where to go. Okay. Well, thank you again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Bye. See you, everyone.